Have you been thinking about getting a ball python and you want to know a little bit more about what their care entails? Stick around because today we're going to do a ball python care guide. Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. My name is Zoe, but most people know me as ZA Reptiles. I'm a former zoo educator and I run my own reptile education business. And today we're going to do another care guide. So today's care guide is going to be for a more popular pet reptile, and that is the ball python. So quick disclaimer before we get too far into the video, one of the most important parts of getting an animal is to do your research, lots and lots of research. The point of this video is just to share how I personally care for my ball pythons, just to give you some perspective from somebody that has 3 of them. But please don't let this video be your only source of research. Do a lot more, read some care guides, watch more videos, and the main thing I'm going to recommend is to visit Reptiles, because Reptiles is the go-to place that I send everybody to learn about how to care for reptiles. So let's jump into the video. Today we're joined by 𝘼𝙪𝙨. He is my champagne paradox ball python. He is the biggest ball python I have and the oldest ball python I have. And during this video, we might see appearances from my other 2 ball pythons as well. So just like with any of my care guides, we're going to start with learning a little bit about the animal as a species. So the ball python, or the royal python, comes from Central and Western Africa. They can be found in a range of habitats, with the main ones being semi-arid grasslands and open forests. Think the savannah. Now when it comes to behaviors, these snakes are, in my opinion, one of the best. They are nocturnal, which means that they are going to be sleeping all day long and awake at night when you're sleeping. So some people don't necessarily like that. You might see your ball python being a little active during the day, but for the most part they're going to be active when you're ready for bed. However, what makes them super awesome is that they are notoriously pretty sweet snakes, and by sweet I mean personality wise, behavior wise, they are very docile, easy to handle, which is what makes them kind of a go-to snake for people that have never had snakes before. They don't move very fast. They're typically, like I said, very docile. I've never met a defensive ball python. I know they're out there, I know people have them. I personally have never met one, so it's not a super common occurrence as far as I'm aware. So they are well known for being good pets. They're calm, they're a little bit shy, so they tend to ball up, which is where the name ball python comes from. So part of their defense mechanism is to ball up. They make a ball with their head inside in the middle. It protects their head, makes them feel safe and secure, but it also makes them very easy to handle. They're also a very hardy snake, so they can handle a few mistakes here and there as you learn how to care for them. Now obviously the goal is as few mistakes as possible, but we're human, so we're bound to make some mistakes in the process. So luckily the ball python is a very hardy snake that can handle that. Now when it comes to their characteristics, the males and females are sexually dimorphic. Females tend to be quite a bit bigger than males. Now 𝘼𝙪𝙨 here is a male as far as I'm aware, but 𝘼𝙪𝙨 is drastically bigger than my other 2 males who are technically adult ages. So I do plan to send in a shed from 𝘼𝙪𝙨 to get tested to just be sure that he is a male, but my other 2 are no doubt males, and you'll see the difference here in a little bit. So males are going to average about 3 to 4 feet in length, with females being about 4 to 5 feet in length. Now some females have reached 6 foot. I have seen some massive females. The female that I worked with when I was a zoo educator was ginormous. I would not be able to film like a video like this with her and hold her the whole time. My arm would be like breaking. She was so heavy, she was so big, but she was so cool. Another thing that makes these snakes very easy to handle is that they are known for their very thick body. Having a thicker body means there's more snake to hold on to, which just makes it so much easier. It's not like a 𝘼𝙪𝙨 who has a long slender body and tends to just slip through your fingers. They're sexually mature at 3 to 5 years. However, their lifespan can be anywhere from 15 to 30 years. The more we learn about proper husbandry and how to improve our husbandry, the longer these guys tend to live. The oldest one currently to date was a 50-year-old ball python at the Philly Zoo. As far as I'm aware, that's the last thing I know about the oldest ball python around. In the wild, they're going to live to about 10 years on average. So like most species, they're going to live longer in captivity, where they're receiving proper care, constant food, clean water, access to veterinary medicine. So it's no surprise these guys are going to live much longer in captivity. Now besides easy handling, what else makes these snakes such high demand when it comes to having a pet? I would say the main thing besides handling is that they come in a variety of morphs. Tons of different colors, tons of different patterns. Me personally, some of my favorites are the banana ball python like Snicket, the pied ball python, but also thanks to 𝘼𝙪𝙨, I have really fallen in love with paradox ball pythons. I think it's so cool. So what makes a paradox? Do you notice how his head pattern and color looks different from the rest of his body? That brown on his head resembles more of a normal ball python, where the rest of his body represents champagne. So that little splash of normal in there would be the paradox. It's not really a morph, it's just a weird occurrence. So as far as I'm aware, you can't breed for paradox, it's just something that happens. So I do think it's super cool, super unique, and super pretty. And the last thing I want to touch on before we get into the actual care aspects is, should they be cohabbed? Can you cohab? I'm just going to flat out say no. My general rule of thumb for pet keepers, 99% of the time, don't cohab your reptiles. They aren't lonely, they don't need a friend. There are some reptile species out there that are known to live in groups in the wild. However, the majority that we're keeping in captivity are perfectly happy all by themselves. Usually cohabbing can do more harm than good, especially if you're not doing it correctly. Sometimes you'll see species cohabbed in zoos. There are ways to do it, and you have to be very strategic about it, which is why I don't recommend that the general pet keeper experiment with cohabitation. So now let's jump into the actual care aspects of keeping a ball python. Alright, we did a little snake swap. This is Snicket, he is my banana ball python, and Snicket and I are going to talk about enclosure sizes. Now before we get too far into the size, I do want to talk about snake racks versus everything else. It's a very common debate when it comes to keeping ball pythons especially, but a lot of reptiles, is whether or not snake racks are ethical. Because I'm talking about my experiences, how I keep ball pythons, and this is a care guide for the general pet keeper, I'm going to say don't use snake racks. Our goal as pet keepers is to provide our snakes or our reptiles with the highest level of care that we can. We want to go above and beyond. And as a pet parent, you can do better than a snake rack. I would say leave those to the breeders. Use them for quarantine, that is okay. But when it comes to long-term keeping of your pet snake, you can go bigger and do better than a snake rack. Now, something people don't realize is that ball pythons are actually considered semi-arboreal snakes. Especially juveniles and males, they are known to climb in the wild. There has been studies on this. We have found birds in their wild diet, and males have been seen climbing. And I can confirm that to be true. I have 3 males, and all 3 of them love to climb. So I have to make sure that I provide opportunities to do that. So that being said, you want to make sure that your enclosure is tall enough for that. People used to say ball pythons to be kept in an enclosure that was only a foot tall or 12 inches. And quite frankly, I just don't believe that that is tall enough. For a small male, I would go at least 18 to 20 inches, but in general, 2 feet is the way to go. So both of my small males are in enclosures that are 18 inches tall, where 𝘼𝙪𝙨, the one we met at the beginning, is in this 4x2x2. So let's talk about stages of life. Ultimately, with ball pythons being kind of shy, secretive snakes, you want to make sure that they are comfortable. Now we'll talk about how to set up your enclosure to make them comfortable. But as far as sizes go, when you have a baby ball python, you can start smaller. You don't have to put a baby right into a 4x2x2. You can start with something as simple as a 20-gallon or a 24x12x12 𝘼𝙤𝙬, and then grow them and move them as they get older. A juvenile could live in something like a 40 breeder, a 40 to 50-gallon setup, or a 36x18x18 𝘼𝙤𝙬. But then adults, especially larger adults, should have a minimum of 120 gallons or a 4x2x2. Like we said, that's what 𝘼𝙪𝙨 is in. You can get away with a little bit smaller with a smaller male ball python, but remember, they still will use the space provided to them if set up correctly. My general rule of thumb when it comes to housing snakes is I want an enclosure that's long enough for them to stretch out in. Both Snicket and Mojito can stretch out in about a 3-foot enclosure, where 𝘼𝙪𝙨 can stretch out in a 4-foot enclosure. So that's my general rule of thumb. I want my snakes to be able to fully stretch out the length of their enclosure. So that can help you as well with determining what size enclosure you should get. Now when it comes to substrate, there's a couple different options you can do. You can get commercial reptile substrate, like ReptiChip or ReptiBark. I've used both, I like both. You can get pre-made bioactive mixes, like what you can get from the BioDude. Or what I do is I make my own substrate. I do this using organic topsoil and play sand, which I can get right at Home Depot, and I mix them to a consistency that I'm happy with. So I use more topsoil than I do play sand. Play sand is just a little bit. And then I'll mix in things like moss, and then my personal favorite, leaf litter. Just because it really makes it look natural, it brings it all together. And just a little tip when it comes to substrate, the thicker the substrate, the easier it is to maintain higher humidity levels. So if you do a nice layer of substrate, that should definitely help you with your humidity, which we will talk about in a little bit. So you'll want to avoid aspen because ball pythons actually require slightly higher humidity levels than people have thought in the past. And aspen can mold. Aspen is meant for more drier, arid setups. and so you really don't want that in a setup that's going to need some humidity. Another one to avoid is reptile carpet. Reptile carpet, that green stuff that you see in the store, sometimes it's brown. That will hold bacteria. It is very hard to efficiently clean, so you're better off just completely avoiding it and going for a more natural type of substrate. For you as the keeper, it's going to look better, but it's also going to help you achieve the other aspects of their care, like humidity, like we had mentioned. So while we're on the topic of the enclosure, and we just filled the enclosure with substrate, now let's talk about decor and enrichment. This is very important for ball pythons. Remember, we had mentioned earlier, they're a little bit more of a shy, secretive snake. So the more you can put in there, the happier they are going to be and the safer they are going to feel. Clutter is one of the most important things when it comes to keeping ball pythons. That's one of the arguments I hear all the time from people that would prefer to keep their snakes in racks. They say, you know, I put them into a bigger enclosure and they never came out. They stopped eating. It was overwhelming. But what happened was they've got a warm hide, a cool hide, and maybe that middle hide. So what we always talk about you needing, those 3 hides, and a water dish. But they've got all this open space in between, so if that snake leaves that hide, it's exposed, it's out in the open. So the more you can fill it with sticks, cork bark, more hides, rocks, things to climb on, things to climb under, the safer they're going to feel and the more they're going to explore. I also want to take a moment just to mention that when you take a snake that has lived in a rack and you put it into a larger enclosure, keep in mind that is a big change for them, and it's going to take some adjusting to get used to that. So back to what we were talking about with enrichment and decor. So making sure that you have plenty of hides, also your water dish for soaking and for drinking. I personally love using cork rounds as hides, and for basking and for climbing, all sorts of driftwood. It also provides them with exercise. They have to climb, move around to get from one place to another. Obesity is a big problem with captive ball pythons because sometimes they're not provided the room and the enrichment to be able to get that kind of exercise and to move their bodies around and to climb. So they tend to get a little chunky. And also providing plants and foliage, that's a great way for them to feel safe, secure, and hidden, but also it just looks nice. It adds a pop of color to your enclosure. If you want to go with live plants, I recommend things like pothos because they are very hardy plants that can hold up to some heavy-bodied snakes. So humidity is very important for their overall health. It helps them with shedding. It helps them to prevent respiratory infections. So you want to be monitoring their humidity levels. So what we're looking at is about 60 to 80% humidity during the day and anywhere from 80 to 100 at night. Now this is a lot higher than people have been doing in the past, but as a whole, we've seen ball pythons doing great with these higher humidity levels. So that is what I go by, that is what I try to achieve. Now humidity drops and spikes are both very healthy for reptiles. It's very natural. It's not always going to be 80% humidity. It's not always going to be 60% humidity. It's not always going to be 100% humidity. So the change in humidity levels is very beneficial, very healthy for them. That's why we have these ranges, so that your humidity can fluctuate within a safe range and still be okay for your animal. Now, tricks to reaching this level of humidity: mixing moss into your enclosure. Like we said, a deeper, thicker substrate is another way. Providing a humid hide that you can depend on for having proper humidity levels, especially if you have a hard time keeping your general humidity up. Maybe you live in a dry area, maybe because it's the middle of winter. Having a humid hide can be very beneficial, so that you know there is a place the animal can go to reach those higher humidity levels. And also misting is another great way, and going bioactive. Bioactive kind of requires that you have more humidity because of your live plants, your isopods, just being a general ecosystem. So let's move on to lighting, starting with heat. So what temperatures should you be keeping them at? For basking, I aim for 95 to 105 degrees. Remember, they come from Africa, so it's quite warm where they come from, but that's also just their basking. So the main hot spot in their enclosure, that's where I want that to be. In general, the warm side of their enclosure, I aim for about 85 to 90 degrees. Quite a bit less from their basking temperature, so that's just the warm side. So the heat is warming up that whole side, but the spot where that heat directly is hitting is the one that's up to about 100 degrees. Now their cool side, about 72 to 80 degrees. So it's very important to have a warm side and a cool side. That way the animal can self-regulate. So if your ball python gets too hot, it has somewhere it can go to cool off. If it's too cool, it can go somewhere to get warmer. It's very important that it has that gradient so they can control how they are feeling. And then at nighttime, they can handle a little bit of a drop. So if anywhere from 70 to 80 degrees at night is usually what I aim for. When it comes to lights, I go for a kind of 12-12 hour system with all my animals, so 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. This helps develop a circadian rhythm where they know, okay, it's daytime and okay, it's nighttime. So how can you provide heat? The way that I recommend and the way that I use with all my animals are halogen floodlights. This is the most naturalistic form of heat. I will be doing a separate video on this in the future, so make sure to subscribe so that when that comes out, you'll know. But halogen floodlights make it super easy to hit those higher temperatures, but they also do a better job at really warming the animal internally. A very common thing people use are heat pads. Now, these are okay as supplemental heat, but they really don't do a great job at warming up your animal internally. But if you're going to use one, make sure it covers about 1/3 of the bottom of your enclosure, and that you always use a thermostat with one. Never use a heat pad without a thermostat. You will risk burning your animal, which you don't want to do. Another common option are radiant heat panels, a lot like a heat mat, but they are installed at the top of your enclosure so your heat is coming from above, which is more natural. They also do a better job at covering a wider area because it's not just a bulb, it's like a big pad almost, and the whole thing heats up. So these are a very easy way to heat up larger snakes that have more body to heat up. If you need supplemental heat at night, heat pads and radiant heat panels are a good way to go because they don't put off any light, which helps the animals to know that it is nighttime, but also stay warm enough if your house is too cold. Another great thing you can use at night are ceramic heat emitters. Again, only with a thermostat because you will risk burning your pet. This goes for any type of heat that doesn't provide light. You want to hook up a thermostat so you can visibly see what the temperature is, but also note that is being controlled and that it's not going to overheat. Another great thing you can use are deep heat projectors. Now, I would put these up with halogen floodlights as being beneficial. They do a better job at internally warming the animals than all the other heat options besides halogen floodlights. And they don't put off any form of light. So I would say my top two would be halogen floodlights and deep heat projectors. Absolutely stay away from heat rocks. I don't know how they're still being sold today. And the concept is great. The execution just is not. Again, they're an unregulated form of heat that can commonly cause burns on your animals, which you don't want to do. Now, another tip for maintaining these temperatures is to buy yourself a temperature gun. So a little gun with a laser pointer, very easy to use. You point it at the area you want to know the temperature of, and it gives you an estimated reading. This is a great way to quickly check basking temperatures, but also just to check your temperatures in general. It's very easy just to have it on hand, point it at your two sides, your basking area, and know what the temperatures are and if you need to make any adjustments. The last form of lighting that I want to talk about before we do a little snake swap again is UVB. So ball pythons are one of those animals where UVB isn't considered a must-have. It is an optional. They're not diurnal and coming out and laying on a rock in the middle of the daytime, getting all toasty and those strong levels of UVB. However, UVB has been proven to be beneficial to all animals. Even those who are nocturnal will do something called cryptic basking, which means part of their body is still exposed to the sun, meaning they are getting low levels of UVB. Also, a lot of nocturnal animals can kind of teeter on the side of being crepuscular, which means they come out at dawn and dusk, which means that sun isn't all the way down yet, which means there are still low levels of UVB. So knowing that in the wild they may still be getting very low levels of UVB, why not provide that to them in captivity as well? Your animals can only benefit from it. So with UVB, you want it to cover about half of your enclosure. And in order to do that, that means you're using linear UVB, not those coil bulbs, not those compact bulbs, but a linear T5HO is what I recommend, especially from Arcadia. That is what I use for all of my animals, and I love Arcadia. I can't say enough good things about them. Now, their UVI or UV index is going to be in the 2 to 3 range. If you don't understand what that means, I will link a video up here somewhere to a video where I used a solar meter to test all of my UVBs and determine whether or not my animals are getting the proper amount and what Ferguson zones they fall in. And very important to note is what UVB you get and what level will depend on your placement. For example, Kalua's UVB is inside of his enclosure. However, because he's a snake, I do have a UV guard over the top of it so that he cannot access the bulb, which means that the UVB is having to go through that kind of mesh, which reduces the level. So for him, I go with a little bit of a higher UVB because I know that some of that is being filtered out to get through that mesh. So if your UVB is having to go through a bulb guard like that, or maybe a screen on an enclosure, you're going to want a little bit of a higher level UVB because you're going to be having some filtered out. Your animal isn't going to get the full power of that UV. Mojito is shedding right now, but the show must go on. So we're going to get into our last 2 points. First one being diet. So when it comes to feeding any snakes, you want to go towards feeding frozen thawed. This is the most ethical, the most humane, but also the safest for your snake. Because imagine if you were feeding a rat, because ball python's going to get pretty big, remember. If you're feeding an adult rat and that rat fights back, now you potentially have a damage done to your snake and are going to have to pay for a vet visit. Now, ball pythons are notoriously tricky when it comes to switching up their food. They can be quite picky. So normally I'm going to tell you variety is key, offering not just rats, but rats, mice, quail, chicken, African soft furs, gerbils, reptilings, whatever you can find to provide variety to your snake is going to be the best thing for them when it comes to their diet. It's going to make sure that there's no nutritional gaps. They're getting the nutritional benefits of each item. If your ball python isn't picky and will take various items, fantastic. Most ball pythons won't though. They get habituated to an item and that is their item for life. Each individual is going to have their preference though. For example, Snicket will take just about anything I give him, but there are some things he won't take. Mojito is a garbage disposal, and out of my 3 ball pythons, he will take reptilinks like it's nothing. He will go nuts for them. And ball pythons don't normally take reptilinks. They're not really advertised for ball pythons. Mojito though, he loves his reptilinks. 𝘬𝙪 is a little more picky. He tends to just go for rats. Sometimes he'll take a quail. His last feeding, he actually took a reptilink though. But in general, he's my rat eater. Now there's a common misconception that you have to move your snakes out of their enclosures to eat. Otherwise they might become defensive inside their enclosure. Now this is not true. It actually would be better if you didn't handle your snakes before and after they eat. And snakes are smarter than we give them credit for. So if you're worried about your snake confusing you for food, there are things you can do like tap training. So do some research on that. But in general, I feed all of my snakes in their enclosure and I haven't had a problem. Now one concern with ball pythons is that they can go off food on top of being picky eaters. Now common times they might go off food is the winter seasons and breeding season. The big thing is to not panic. That seems to be the main thing with ball python keepers. And people that want to keep ball pythons, they tend to panic a little bit when their snake doesn't eat, which is understandable. The best thing to do is just to track their weight. That way you can see for sure if their weight is dropping. If their weight is dropping, that can be some concern. There might be something going on internally, maybe an infection of some sort, and you should seek out vet care. In general, if you're worried about your snake not eating, I would seek out vet care just to rule out anything. But in general, a snake not eating for a month or 2 isn't really cause for concern, unless their weight is drastically dropping and their body condition isn't looking good. So like I said, if you're worried about the condition of your snake, definitely seek out vet care. The last thing I want to touch on in this video are common health issues with ball pythons so that you can be prepared and you know what to research. One that we had mentioned already are burns. This usually happens when heat malfunctions or is used improperly. So just make sure that you are keeping an eye on the temperatures that your snake is exposed to and that you're using your heating equipment properly, whether that's using dimmers or thermostats. Another issue that we also mentioned is obesity. So making sure you're not overfeeding your snake, that your snake is getting plenty of opportunities to move around and exercise to remain nice and healthy. Respiratory infections are another very common one when it comes to keeping reptiles in general. It's like your common cold, but for reptiles, and you will need to seek out veterinary care to help them overcome it. IBD is another one that you should really have an understanding of and know the signs of, so definitely do some research on IBD if you plan on getting snakes in general, but especially if you plan on getting ball pythons. And the last one are mites. Mites are not fun at all. This goes for really any reptile keeper, but especially if you keep snakes. Know what mites are, know how to identify mites, and know how to be prepared to treat mites should you ever get them. Don't be ashamed if you get them. It happens to even the best of us. A couple of years ago, I ended up with mites that started with my ball pythons, honestly. 𝘬𝙪 and Snicket both got them, and then it was passed to my 𝘬𝙪𝙨 I'm very fortunate that those are the only 3 animals out of all of my animals that got them. But it was not a fun time. It was very stressful. So try to do what you can to avoid mites at all costs. so do lots of research on that so that you are prepared for both preventing them but also treating them should the worst happen. Alright, that is it for today's video. If you keep ball pythons and you have some other ball python tips that maybe I missed or you want to elaborate on, leave them in the comments below. If you have ball python questions, also leave those in the comments below. We're all about learning and growing here. And as always, thank you guys for watching. We'll see you for the next video. Bye!